Events surrounding the People's Republic of China have been in the paper almost constantly since last June 4th, and prior to that time, during the student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. June 4th was the date that the troops moved in, and according to Chinese reports, stubbed 3 people's toes, and according to a number of other more accurate, we hope, reports, killed a number of people. And those changes that were wrought in China run just counter to what has been happening at the same time in Eastern Europe, where communism has been opening its doors and tearing down walls. We have an excellent opportunity today to hear from one of a very few people who was in China shortly after the crackdown, and in fact he tells me he arrived on July 24th. He was in fact the only American scholar in China this last summer and spent 5 weeks there, both as a researcher for Portland State University and more importantly as a specialist with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. His connection with that organization allowed him much more free travel and access than he may have had otherwise. Our speaker is Mr. Mel Gurtov, who is Director of International Studies and Professor of Political Science at Portland State University. Previously, he taught at the University of California, Riverside and was on the staff of the Rand Corporation. He received a PhD from UCLA. He has written 10 books on China and on international politics, and he has visited the People's Republic of China several times prior to this last summer's events. Would you help me welcome our speaker today on the tragedy in China, why it happened, and what lies ahead, Professor Mel Gurtov.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon and share some of my experiences and impressions having left China at the very end of this past August. As I try to make sense of what has happened in China over the last several months, 4 people come to mind as symbols of the enormity of the transformation that has occurred. There is, first of all, Professor Yan Jiaqi, a serious, profound, soft-spoken member of the Institute of Political Science in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, where I worked. Yan was close to Zhao Ziyang, the now purged General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. When Professor Yan visited Portland last February to attend a conference on the Soviet and Chinese reforms at PSU, he spoke out on the necessity of reducing the Communist Party's dominant position in state and society, and of developing a more pluralistic, law-abiding system. When the crackdown came in Beijing on June 4, Yan's name was near the top of the Chinese government's most wanted list. He and his wife barely escaped Beijing via Hong Kong. Now, Yan is president of the Chinese Democratic Movement in exile. His writings are banned in China, and he has, of course, been stripped of all his former posts, including membership in the Chinese Communist Party. The second person is the man known to you, I think, and to most of the world as the one who stopped the tanks. At the height of the demonstrations, when it seemed possible that nonviolent protest by Beijing students and workers would topple the leadership, this 19-year-old son of a factory worker placed himself in the way of a line of tanks and for several minutes kept them from advancing. He was pulled away by his friends. Reliable reports indicate he was followed, arrested, and almost immediately executed. This man, Wang Weilin, will long be remembered for what he represented, the near triumph of people power over a government and army that were rapidly losing their legitimacy in the eyes of Beijing citizens. The third person who symbolizes today's China cannot be named, for to do so would probably endanger him. He is one of many Chinese intellectuals I spoke with, candidly and at length, many of them party members, about life in Beijing since June 4. He described to me their grief, anger, and in many cases shame at the unnecessary violence the leadership used to quash the demonstrations. He described the political so-called study sessions that have been held twice weekly since mid-July, initially held to re-educate intellectuals on the correctness of the leadership's actions, and later to obtain information on the activities of each person and his or her acquaintances during each day of the several weeks of demonstrations. And this person also indicated to me now the great care that must be exercised in choosing subjects for research. Despite all of this pressure, he retains his good humor and a quiet confidence in China's democratic future. What he says is, "Ya bufu," we are bowed but unbent. Finally, there is Mr. Wang Meng, China's Minister of Culture at the time of the crackdown. To many Chinese, the fate of this writer of fiction, whose sharp social criticisms in the 1950s led to his being criticized and imprisoned in distant Xinjiang province for nearly 20 years, would say much about the leadership's attitude to cultural diversity, and especially to Western ideas. Throughout the summer, the Communist Party kept up a steady barrage against so-called bourgeois liberal influences in art, media, and literature, picking up where it had left off in the winter of 1986 and 87. Several Chinese intellectuals saw Wang's survival in office this summer as a sign that the official attack was only temporary. But on September 4, Wang Meng was dismissed. The brief flourishing of cultural pluralism has been replaced by emphasis on social discipline and ideological conformity. These four personal stories embrace the rise and fall of hopes for a more pluralistic and democratic Chinese future. What went wrong? Why did the Chinese leadership resort to widespread repression? Not merely by letting the army loose against unarmed civilians, but also by arresting at least several thousand people. The commonly accepted figure is 10,000, 5,000 in Beijing alone, executing and imprisoning many of them, and purging key figures in the government, the party, and intellectual circles. In doing so, it had to calculate the high price it would pay internationally, alienating foreign governments, businesses, and international lending agencies, feeding suspicions and fears in Hong Kong and Taiwan, at home losing the support of its educated elite, its most precious resource, and thus, in all, seriously setting back the very modernization program that it had worked so hard to develop. One strong motivation, it seems to me, for using force was to reestablish a fundamental principle of politics throughout these 10 years of post-Mao reform, namely that political reforms must not be allowed to interfere with economic reforms. To the hardliners, democratic practices, such as street demonstrations and strikes by workers, directly threaten modernization. They are also a reminder of cultural revolutionary anarchy. Zhao Ziyang was removed by the hardliners because of his apparent willingness to tolerate such popular outbursts. The hardliners wanted, and still want, the technological and efficiency benefits of a market system while maintaining the political control mechanisms of a command system. In short, Milton Friedman and Mao. We can therefore understand why Mikhail Gorbachev's visit to Beijing in mid-May could not have come at a worse time for Deng Xiaoping. The last thing Deng wants for China is perestroika with glasnost. When the students pressed their case, and even though their numbers had actually dwindled considerably to the point where in late May, many students were ready to go back to classes, the hardliners, and Deng especially, insisted on getting tough. The alternative, as they saw it, was loss of control. They broke the deadlock within the leadership, ousted Zhao Ziyang, and cleared the square. Fear of loss of control led to the second major motivation for the crackdown. Again, as Chinese intellectuals, as well as I, see it. This was the possibility that the student and worker federations, as they were called, that had formed during and after the hunger strike would evolve, like Solidarity in Poland, into a full-fledged political opposition that would directly challenge the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Allowing these federations and other organizations to blossom in the manner of the blooming, 100 flowers blooming and contending in China in the late 1950s, when the party briefly encouraged and then cracked down on democratic dissent, could not be permitted. Having said this much should give us pause, because it indicates how badly many observers in the West, including many China specialists, allowed their own hopes and models of democratic development to get in the way of careful analysis of Chinese realities. Chinese intellectuals in Beijing are inclined to agree with my suggestion that Westerners were remiss in attaching so much weight to the economic reforms. They failed to take sufficient account either of the new problems those reforms would create, such as inflation, widening income gaps, and graft, or of the narrow limits within which the Chinese leadership was willing to consider political reforms. They mistook Deng for a liberal reformer out to overhaul the Chinese system. The result was an unwarranted optimism about China's ability to modernize rapidly and democratically. Nor have Western analysts clearly ascertained the negative, along with the positive, lessons that Deng and his colleagues have drawn from the economic successes of the four little dragons, as they're called, of East Asia: Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. To China's leaders, the development and experiences of these four dragons underscore the dangers of opening up the political process, dangers such as strikes, student demonstrations, and the constant criticisms of an organized opposition party, while experimenting with the market. That is why the leaders, China's leaders, have become infatuated with the notion of what is called the new authoritarianism, which is being pushed today by young Chinese economists. This concept, of course, isn't new at all, as the reform intellectuals I encountered in Beijing pointed out. It simply rationalizes China's new order, the retreat from political accountability, and instead the cultivation of enlightened despotism. In this light, the crushing of the demonstrations has had one positive side. It has forced us to pay attention to the extensiveness of corruption and nepotism, of inflation and budget deficits, of tax evasion and environmental neglect, all of which had existed in China well before the summer of this year. We can also better appreciate that the political reforms that did take place, such as the removal from government administrative work of many old party hacks in favor of younger specialists, were largely designed to expedite economic planning and not to make the political system more pluralistic or to weaken one-party rule. Many of China's intellectuals were aware of and deeply troubled by these realities, so that Deng Xiaoping's response to the demonstrations only tended to confirm their worst fears about the competence and the commitment to openness of the regime. What about the period since June 4? China, since the crackdown, in many ways bears the features, at the surface at least, of a society once again in equilibrium. Martial law still prevails in Beijing, but troops have been pulled out of the key intersections. People go about their daily business. There's an abundance of goods on the free market. Public places of entertainment are crowded on Sundays. People are back at work. Moreover, the Chinese government has certainly learned some things from the tragic events. It has prosecuted a number of major corruption cases and even executed some particularly brazen thieves, but not those who wear white collars. It has established new rules to reduce the privileges of senior officials and their profiteering from financial involvement in businesses. It has closed down thousands of rural enterprises that did not pay taxes or are simply inefficient. It has somewhat reduced last year's record inflation in the urban areas of 30% by cutting government credit and reducing unnecessary imports. And it has proclaimed that the policy of opening to the outside world will never change, quote unquote. Of special interest to me, and here was one of the main reasons why I went to China in the first place, under a grant from the Oregon Committee for the Humanities, was to examine at closer range China's ambitious program to convert military industries to civilian production everything from aircraft and satellites to cameras and refrigerators. This program is linked to an ongoing reassessment of global strategy. The Chinese use the same term as the Soviets, new thinking. And it also comes from a greatly diminished view of the usefulness of military force in China's foreign policy. China's military reforms have led to some very impressive results. The demobilization of 1 million soldiers in the 1980s, a major drop in military spending in relation to GNP from 10% in 1978 to 4% in 1988, a similar drop in the military share of the government budget from 1/4 to about 1/5 between 78 and 1988, and the reorganization of military industries to promote efficiency and the search for new markets at home and abroad. Here, I think, is a positive program that has been undertaken unilaterally, and that is a concrete example for other societies, including, I might add, especially in the context of events in Europe, for the Soviet Union itself and for Eastern Europe. But, just beneath the surface are some sobering developments that put China's future in a different light. The PRC leadership has set out to punish party members who participated in the calls for social change. All major institutions, especially the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Beijing universities, have come under scrutiny and their members forced to undergo study of the top leaders' speeches. The problem with those speeches is that they offer nothing to reform-minded party members as an alternative to the official orthodoxy, which is, quote, strengthening the dictatorship of the proletariat. Political reform in China, in any comprehensible sense, is dead, unless one accepts the new General Secretary's definition of reform as meaning the reinforcement of centralized party leadership over all affairs. This also means that the official goal to decentralize the economy must also be reversed. The tendency to slow the economic reforms had already begun well before June 4th because of mounting inflation, the dissatisfaction of urbanites over rising prices, excessive government spending and industrial orders for materials, 4 years of failure in agriculture to regain the high ground of 1984 levels of production, and the rapid growth of the budget deficit by 50% last year, and of China's international debt, which now stands at $40 billion. Since June 4, the slowing has intensified for political as much as for economic reasons. Reforms to strengthen markets cannot be expected so long as the central government is out to reestablish social controls. The major trends in China's education, as I think many of us are already aware, are also changing. First-year students at Beijing University have been shipped off to the military academy at Shijiazhuang for a full year of political and military, quote, training. The universities, that is Beijing University's new president, has faithfully towed the party line by saying he is sympathetic with the students' needs, but insisting on political uniformity. Reductions are scheduled in the number of new students who will be admitted to Beijing's premier schools, particularly in the social sciences, and in students allowed to study in the United States and several other countries. Professors will inevitably be closely watched for signs of political deviation. Pluralism in the arts, the press, and literature has again come to a halt. Reimposed party controls mean that culture must again be cleaned up, as in the current campaign against pornography, which oftentimes is merely a pretext for removing bourgeois books or contentious books and magazines from stalls. China's door to cultural diversity had begun to swing pretty widely open before June 4th. Now it is locked tightly, and we cannot expect to see the same rich array of film techniques, literary approaches, and political criticism that had previously flourished. Chinese with whom I spoke were uniformly disbelieving about the leadership's interest in fighting corruption and other abuses of office. This is understandable, given that so many relatives of the top leaders continue to enjoy opportunities based on connections rather than merit. Everyone understands that political reforms, such as an investigative press and oversight of the Chinese Communist Party itself, are essential to curbing corruption. But these elements of democracy are far from the minds of the current leaders. A mixture of fear and loathing, I would say, predominates among the people I spoke with in Beijing. Fear that a dissatisfied leadership will decide to continue its campaign, which has already lasted 5 months, against laxity and weakness ideologically in the ranks of party members and workers, and loathing of the controls that have been again placed upon people. People are not about to take to the streets anytime again soon. But on the other hand, the failure of the authorities to catch all the student and intellectual leaders of the demonstrations, or prevent some of them from fleeing China, suggests the existence of a network of non-cooperators. This is extraordinary in a country renowned for its closely meshed surveillance system. My basic point, to summarize here, is that China's economy and political stability are in deep trouble, and that the effect of the pro-democracy demonstrations has been to intensify problems of economic mismanagement, corruption, and political rigidity that had existed well before the crackdown. In its effort to shift attention from itself, however, the Chinese leadership has insisted that the demonstrations were the work of a small handful of troublemakers, abetted by the United States, Taiwan, and other outside forces. We only need turn this nonsense around to get at the truth. The dangerous handful of people are those in the leadership who suppressed the demonstrations and who are continuing to this moment to arrest people. It is their actions that interfere with mutually beneficial relations between our two countries. Nevertheless, I believe that we ought not to permit official repression of ideas and people in China from standing in the way of beneficial people-to-people contacts. Cultural, educational, and commercial ties are especially valuable now for 2 basic reasons. First, they give encouragement to our friends and colleagues over there who want the reforms to continue and who in many instances put their careers on the line during May and June by demonstrating on behalf of the reforms. Our continuing commitment to them expresses our good faith and support. The very first morning after arrival in China, I sat down with the very same group that was here in Portland this past February from the Chinese Academy. And one of the first things they said was, "Thank you for coming and having confidence in us." Not in their government, in us. Secondly, these contacts have concrete value. They are tangible contributions in the economy, in the workplace, in schools, in the arts and literature, in government too, to the reform process itself, and to the livelihoods of many, many thousands of individuals. To be sure, the U.S. government, for its own reasons most Chinese I talk with assume that have at least as much to do with domestic American politics as they do with U.S.-China relations, frowns on most forms of contact with the PRC, although that may now, as you've been reading in the paper, be about to change. But that is a matter, in any case, of government-to-government relations. Relations between peoples, I think, should follow different rules. People-to-people and firm-to-firm contacts do not, to my mind, support the Chinese government's repressive policies. China is not South Africa. It is not Lebanon or El Salvador or Burma or the West Bank, where repression is systematic, long-lasting, and all-encompassing. Continuing or establishing contacts with Chinese citizens can still occur, I think, in ways that enhance their position and strengthen their morale in the face of their government's policies. On the other hand, terminating contacts or imposing sanctions harsher than the military sanctions that President Bush has already approved seems to me very unlikely to improve the circumstances of our Chinese friends or the prospects for reform. Most of the intellectuals I spoke with in Beijing, in fact, do not favor such steps. My sense is that attempting to punish the Chinese government not only would not work, it would be counterproductive. It would make reform-minded Chinese vulnerable to their government's charge that, quote, foreign forces are working with pro-Western dissidents at home to subvert the government and divert it from its modernizing agenda. We should not expose ourselves or our friends to such manipulative appeals to narrow nationalism. Alexis de Tocqueville once wrote that the worst moment for a bad government is when it begins to reform itself. That moment may already be at hand in Beijing, as the party government leadership seeks to mask its divisions and smooth over massive social problems with superficial changes. Real change is highly unlikely to come suddenly, however. Short of the death of the supreme leader, at least three things, I think, may have to happen for the current state of affairs to change decisively. First, the military's loyalty to the political leadership must run out. Either it must decide to remove itself from political turmoil, or it must reject the party leadership placed over it. There evidently are many officers who deeply resented Deng's call on the army to quash the demonstrations, and several retired senior military leaders, in fact, petitioned Deng Xiaoping not to do so. The military's attitude may ultimately depend on how much new money it squeezes from future budgets. If it is paid off for its troubles in Tiananmen Square, the military's loyalty may be purchased. But if not, its loyalty may be up for grabs. Secondly, what has to change is the situation in Eastern Europe. It must continue to move toward more open systems of economics and politics. As one of my confidants in Beijing said, China's reform prospects will be significantly influenced by the success or failure of the experiments with democracy that began in Hungary and Poland and now continue in East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Third, economic and social conditions in China must deteriorate to the point of causing a crisis of confidence both internally and internationally. For example, the large-scale movement that has been occurring of tens of millions of unemployed farmers into the cities could provide the spark for a renewal of anti-government activism. These are not circumstances that we in the United States can significantly influence. Indeed, attempting to manipulate Chinese affairs would probably have the opposite effect of what we intend. Nor, I would speculate, are the efforts of China's pro-democracy movement in exile likely to have much impact. China's course will, as always, be determined mainly by internal forces, including those students, workers, and intellectual leaders and researchers who put themselves on the line in May and June. My ultimate optimism about China rests with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gurtov, for a fascinating look at history in the making. As I said earlier, we have the option for both oral questions. A microphone is being moved to the center of the room now. I would urge any of you that do have an oral question, since we are a bit crowded today, you might start making your way now so that we don't fall over each other, as I would if I tried to move around in this crowd. And if you have a written question, please hold it up so the staff can pick it up and bring it forward. Our first question will come from our board host, Chip Greening.
By any standard, 1989 is bound to be considered a remarkable year. And for those of us who do not follow international relations as much as you do, Professor, we try to sort out these events, and sometimes it's difficult. I'd like to hear from you your opinion of why the Soviet Union, at least Gorbachev and his supporters, view the linkage between perestroika and glasnost essential, whereas the Chinese leaders, as you just described it, want perestroika without glasnost. Why the difference?
Well, it's a very good question. The easier answer is the second part on the Chinese side, because I think it's clear that just as reform-minded people want to see that linkage develop, and therefore, as I mentioned, are paying such close attention, and it's hard to do this, to what is happening in the Soviet Union and especially in Eastern Europe. So for the opposite reason, does Mr. Deng and his group in the leadership fear what is happening over there. It's clear that every success for the reform process in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe gives Deng more ammunition to say, you see, look what's happening. Number one, the party is rapidly losing legitimacy in every country in which reforms are occurring. In fact, it's being pushed to the margin as a future leadership group. Secondly, reforms encourage ethnic nationalism, and probably more so than certainly even Mr. Gorbachev would like. But the Chinese also have their large numbers of ethnic minorities. Look at what happened some time ago, and obviously not for the first time, in Tibet. So that reforms open up everything to questioning. Once you open the door, you can't very easily close it. This is why Deng Xiaoping only opened the door a small crack and made very clear, although we were not inclined to listen to him until now, that political reforms have to take a very large back step compared to the economic reforms. So it's very clear where the interest of the current leadership lies in divorcing those two tracks, political and economic reforms, from one another. On the other hand, as we found out more personally when the Soviets from Moscow came to visit us for our conference last February, it's clear that Gorbachev has come in to power since March 1985 and continues to believe in the notion that you can't have one without the other. And I think fundamentally what he's saying there, although it breaks down to very specific matters depending upon which sector of society one looks at, is that people's energies, so long bottled up, simply must be allowed creative outlets for genuine reform to take hold. It's not simply a matter of manipulating the structure of the economy and saying that, well, now we'll have more of market mechanisms here and an opportunity for foreign capital there, what have you. People are not going to respond, he recognized, actively, enthusiastically, and for a long period of time to an economic opening unless there is the parallel political, call it, and social opportunity to express themselves. And that form of expression has to take the form, I think Gorbachev recognized, of opportunities for new kinds of political organizations to take shape, for a press to be able to ask hard questions, for people to stand up, as they did in the last Soviet Party Congress, which just amazed the Chinese, stand up and attack the supreme leader himself, if they so wished. That unless, and this applies across the board, to the cultural realm too, to TV, investigative journalism, to the arts, to the right to use fictional characters to make a political point. Unless these kinds of initiatives are allowed to occur, people are simply not going to respond positively to a narrowly economic, narrowly structural kind of reform program. And that's precisely why, to come back to the beginning, Deng Xiaoping and the others who have been through all these years of the Chinese Revolution step back and say, never. This is anarchy. We cannot allow this. And so every forward step that Gorbachev makes on one side is proof positive to the Chinese leadership that they should not allow this. And it's a very unfortunate dynamic there. But that is the dynamic.
Bob Tepper, City Club. Regarding U.S. policy toward China, I wonder what you think of President Bush's veto before he left for Malta of the legislation passed by rather unanimous, if not pretty heavily in both houses of Congress, permitting Chinese students to remain in the United States. The president's defense, of course, was he was ambassador to China at one time. His defense of his action was he was able to achieve the same results by administrative action. However, the congressional people who put the legislation together felt that he missed a big opportunity to demonstrate to both the people and government of China our displeasure of their violation of human rights?
Thank you, Bob. That's a good question, and I knew I was going to get asked this. So naturally, I prepared by reading the Oregonian's lead editorial, which is a very good one, I think, and comes down appropriately very hard on the president for trying to sidestep the issue and sidestep the Congress on this matter by suggesting that the same results can be achieved administratively. Personally, I don't know what that means, and until I see what, in fact, is accomplished administratively and can judge whether it is equivalent to what would have been accomplished by law, only then will I be satisfied. And if it occurs that way, okay. I mean, we're more interested in results than in process. Certainly, he missed an opportunity, and he knew he was missing an opportunity to make a point with the Chinese. And it certainly does look as though he's responding to Chinese displeasure. Whether, in fact, doing the same thing administratively will really get him off the hook with the Chinese anyway is a question mark. He may have engaged in all this finagling for naught. We'll see about that. But personally, if you're asking my view, I think it's unfortunate. I think one of the few things that we can do to influence the total situation is to be good to the Chinese students, families, and scholars who have, for whatever period of time it may be, decided to make their home here. It is a dangerous situation for them. And it's not enough, as you can imagine, to be told, and they have been told many, many times, reassured by their government that nothing will happen to you if you come back. That's a little hard to take when somewhere between several hundred and 2,500 people have been shot in the square and nearby. And when people, as I took pains to emphasize, are still being arrested. So I think that we need to do what we can do in terms of making contact with our appropriate representatives to make the case for an extension for Chinese students. And if that's not exactly what the administrative measure that the president took means, then we should make it mean that.
John White, member. Would you comment more broadly on the American government response to recent events in China? What have we done right? What have we done wrong? What should we have done? Those types of things.
As we're all aware, the U.S. government was very slow in responding to what happened in the square, and so the first thing it ought to have done right is to comment on what was a very clear case of deprivation of human rights. I'm not surprised that this government responded the way it did. After all, for one thing, as was mentioned by the previous questioner, Mr. Bush has his own awareness of China and probably doesn't take counsel with many other specialists. And so he believes that taking the go-slow approach on this, as on so many issues, seems to be the way to go. Fine. But I think when something hits you square in the face, you ought to make a principled response. A principled response. Secondly, I think Mr. Bush's overwhelming concern is on the economic side. I don't think he's really that concerned about political reforms in China. I must say, and I think this is not particular or peculiar to this particular president. I think it's generally been true of post-World War II U.S. presidents dealing with human rights situations in authoritarian regimes. And then again, authoritarian regimes divided between those on the left and those on the right. Mr. Bush, I think, expresses a fairly traditional American concern that the economy somehow stay on track, and if there can be modest measures on the political side so that you don't have blatant repression and that things seem to be gradually lifting, controls that is, that's fine. I don't think the United States is dissatisfied with a market-oriented China that remains authoritarian. and even sometimes heavy-handed in its authoritarianism. I think that's a pretty standing U.S. interest that covers many administrations. Personally, I wish that were not the case. I wish we would adopt human rights standards that would apply across the board to governments left and right. I think the real issue here is what is the human condition, and is there systematic repression or denial of human rights by a particular government, whatever its character might be. And when it is systematic, and when occasions like those that occurred in Beijing occur, then one must speak out. But that has too much ethical content, I think, for most U.S. administrations. Now time has passed. I think the recent decision of just yesterday indicates that the administration is easing its way back to a position where it can, and again in the aftermath also of former President Nixon's visit, which I think set the stage for this, easing its way back to an accommodating position with the Chinese, trying to somehow to recover normalcy both economically and in strategic terms. And this is a matter of again, of government-to-government relations. And what can one say about that? I don't think the situation is normal. It's far from normal at the government-to-government level. And it seems to me that this kind of situation that we now have between the U.S. and China is a perfect example of how people can move forward much better than government a principled connection with other people in a country that is under heavy-handed leadership.
Ed Gilbert, City Club member. You mentioned in passing that there's been a trend towards re-centralization in the economic area in China. There have been various news reports that Governor Yi in Guangdong province has been relatively successful at resisting those efforts. I was wondering if you'd comment as to how successful he may remain in the future in resisting these changes, and perhaps go on afterwards to talk about the effects of this crackdown on Hong Kong in 1997.
Anything else? And also Taiwan and Macau. And, well, what you've pointed to in that first question is a very interesting issue to look at. I don't have any terribly bright answers to it, but the issue there is that in a situation in which Beijing is seeking to reimpose centralization over the economy and much else besides, that there is likely to be a breakaway from the coastal regions, from Guangdong and Fujian and other province leaderships, and from local leaderships below those. After all, those are the areas in which there has been the greatest prosperity from what the Chinese call the opening to the outside world. And so what I would expect, in general terms at least, is that there is going to be a real difficult and ongoing tussle between regional leadership in the coastal areas. This is the area, for those of you not familiar with it, where the special economic zones are and where most of the joint venturing occurs. And this is the area that has benefited most from foreign investment. And I think it was already well established before this crackdown that there was friction and contention between that locality and the central leadership. And I think what you're going to see now in a situation in which there is likely to be decreased, and in fact is decreased foreign investment, in which the government is taking back, demanding more foreign currency from organizations, from institutions, enterprises that are acquiring foreign currency, in which it's a situation in which there are regional contentions too between inland provinces which resent the amount of prosperity that the coastal areas have acquired and which may seek to deny valuable raw materials to them except at a higher price. All of these kinds of things and many more besides are going to be part of a very difficult agenda ahead for economic development in China. And that's quite apart from all the other difficulties of which I only touched on a few in terms of the labor force itself and its quality. So I think you've touched on a very important issue that anyone certainly involved in foreign investment and trade will have to take a very close look at. I might mention, if you'll forgive me a plug, that this coming February, and there's a flyer right outside the door on this, we will have our second major international conference with the Soviets, Chinese, and other trade officials from around the Pacific. And among the Chinese who will be coming here are people from the coastal region. And it will be interesting to ask that question to them and see how they respond. It will be politically tricky to negotiate that question, but then they know exactly what you're talking about. And some people have even speculated that the logic of this situation will be that the coastal regional leadership will be breakaways, that southern or southeast China will become more and more economically, and maybe even more than that, autonomous of central leadership as a result of its belief and its strong commitment to and the dependence of its local economy on the reform process. Now, there was a small question about Hong Kong's future, and we will have a Hong Kong representative to try to answer that one in February too. I think it's perfectly apparent to everyone that Hong Kong, as well as Taiwan, groups, ordinary people, enterprise leaders, what have you, were shocked and deeply troubled by the events in Tiananmen and have, as a result, accelerated the flight of persons, especially trained people, educated people in computer sciences and so forth, out of the country to Australia and Canada in particular. And that flight is, according to someone who was just visiting Portland last week, representing Hong Kong interests, going to redouble in the coming 2 years at least. That's the expectation on the Hong Kong side. And that's easy to understand and believe. The Chinese, on the other hand, in Beijing have responded in a rather inflexible way by reasserting their rights of control over Taiwan. And so every time, at least as I've seen it in the press and official pronouncements, that the subject comes up, the general response from Beijing is to reiterate its determination to take over and reiterate its determination not to see any significant changes in the political and economic alignments that already exist by agreement with the British. And I think there again, if one has a future agenda of things to look for, certainly that's right up there at the top of the list of things to be very, not just look at, but to be deeply concerned about. I think you and I and many others in this room could easily imagine a number of different scenarios in which there is real social and political trouble in Hong Kong as 1997 draws closer, assuming, of course, that there are no changes in Beijing. That's a big assumption, but not too big. But if that's the case, that there are no major changes and virtually the same leadership is in place at that time, you can expect, I would say, that by 1994, 95, and maybe even earlier, there is going to be great difficulty. And I guess I have to say that at the outside, since China reserves this right, that the Chinese could well introduce troops into a chaotic, what it would call a chaotic situation that threatens its national security. I could well see that. Hopefully, though, that before that time comes, there'll be a more enlightened leadership in Beijing, which will take pains to undo systematically the damage that has been done and to reassert confidence. Whether even then it can do that is certainly up in the air.
Dan Goldie, City Club member. Mel, I want to return to an early question that you had. the people generally describe the situation as China being perestroika without glasnost and USSR being glasnost without perestroika, referring to the fact that perestroika, the restructuring of the economy in USSR, hasn't really taken off, which appears to be the major threat to Gorbachev's continuance. My question to you is this: is there anything fundamentally different between the Chinese under communism and the USSR under communism that makes the Chinese respond to the open market possibilities of perestroika, but not the USSR citizens? And does that tell us anything about the prospects for coming out of communism and reform, economic reform in Eastern Europe generally?
Thank you, Dan. Well, there's certainly something in that tells us something, but not all that much. And what I just said doesn't say very much either, come to think of it. But let me reiterate. See, this is what happens when you study Washington too often. You start to speak like them. So let me try to say it in English. I think it's not so much anything embedded in Chinese communism or in China under communism as it is in China historically that makes Chinese more entrepreneurial than the Soviets. What I mean by that very simply is that China has had a long history, not by any means an altogether positive history, but a history of entrepreneurship, extending from conglomerates on down to small-scale landholdings. A system which the Soviets, except for the very brief New Economic Plan period earlier in this century, really has not had. And that experience, I think, much more than anything since 1949, really is what has come back to the fore. Now, whether that experience can translate into an enduring march toward a real market system or not is anybody's guess. One of the things, but it leads me to say something. I think one of the ways in which we continue to be, and particularly the press, begins to be a little bit negligent is to make the assumption that what has happened in China recently, what is happening in Central Europe, represents an overthrow of socialism, and now it's just a matter of when will they reach capitalism, our kind of capitalism. I'm not so sure that that's what's happening. I mean, to be sure, we're witnessing the end of some of the worst features of state socialism, at least as practiced by 20th century leaderships. But it's not at all clear that what reform-minded people want in different countries, including China, is anything like this market system. It may very well be that economics and politics will evolve to some kind of more Swedish model, or a French model, or take your pick, and not a US or British model, or something entirely new that has no name yet. I mean, that's to me also one of the great joys of being alive at this time, is this remarkable potential diversity. You know, it's not a matter of following any one model, because all models have their flaws. So that's the thing, I think. Whether, to me, the most important thing that can happen in China is that there will be an opportunity, again, for creative debate among economists, among trade people, among even political scientists, about which is the most appropriate road for China at this juncture in world history to take. That debate was really beginning to go along in the 80s in China, and it was remarkable, and you had all kinds of views expressed. You know, you really did have a fairly broad spectrum of opinion. You know, whether that would have led to price reforms, let's say, which is now a dead letter, or not, who knows? But right now, the Chinese are stuck in the mire of very firmly centralized planning. And how they're going to get unstuck, I've indicated, is going to take some major changes. But where they'll go from that is hard to say. You know, my guess is that it'll be quite a long time before we can expect to see anything other than a very mixed system with a more like, let's say, 70-30 or at the best 60-40 in terms of the relative weight of central control and a market system. I guess this will be, the President tells me, the last question.
Murray Polanyi, member of the City Club. Dr. Gurtov, relative to the Chinese events of this summer, is there something useful and practical you think that could be learned by Soviet minorities relative to how far you can push, how far you can go? I'm thinking of the Ukrainians, Azerbaijanis, Uzbekis, Latvia, Lithuania, all of these mosaics that form the Soviet Union. The word seems to be out that perhaps it could be serious problems for everything if you push too far. Yes. How do you feel about it? Is there something?
Well, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think most observers, and I'm not a Soviet expert, but I do pay attention to these things, would agree that ethnic and other kinds of nationalisms that are now coming to the fore throughout the Soviet system, and expressions of desires not just for autonomy but for outright independence, are way beyond what was expected by Gorbachev. Or at least, it can be said, have pushed the timetable for those kinds of demands much faster along than anyone in the Soviet leadership could possibly have expected. But it goes along with the idea that, once you do open the door, people are going to squeeze in. And I imagine there are plenty of nationality leaderships in places like the Baltic states, and certainly, let's say, in Soviet Georgia, which has already had the experience of Soviet troops marching in, and a devastating experience with that, who are saying, let's not forget June 4. If it could happen once, granted it's way over there, it could happen here too. And we have to be very careful about how much we jab the bear. And on the other hand, as always happens, in those very same systems, there are people who are saying, look, we have to go for it all right now while we have the chance. We have a legislature. We have real opportunity for debate. We've already acquired a strong measure of economic autonomy, of language and cultural autonomy. We should also use this opportunity now, precisely because it's happening all over, like dominoes falling, to take advantage of that situation, which may never come again. And so I think that, although this is putting it very crudely, because always there are many more than two viewpoints, but I would say, if I had to speculate, that these are the two major ones, and they have to do not with disagreement over what should happen, but over the pace of change and the risks of moving too quickly. Thanks very much again.
I want to thank Mel for a very enlightening presentation, and I hope you will all join us back here at the Benson next week for